So thank you everybody for joining today. I hope you can hear me okay, and please let us know if you can't. Today we're going to take you through our presentation about immigration options following graduation. I'm Alexandra Mason, a senior caseworker at Latitude Law, and my colleague Keelan Claffey, a solicitor at Latitude Law, is joining, and she's going to discuss with you the skilled worker route later on. Once people have graduated, the holders of student visas, the most common routes for people who've completed their course tend to be a graduate visa or a skilled worker visa. It sometimes can be possible to switch on to a skilled worker visa if you haven't completed your course yet, but your certificate of sponsorship has a start date later than your course completion date, and we'll explain that to you in more detail shortly. And then other options that people sometimes consider are global talent visas or family visas. I'll go through with you now the requirements of a graduate visa. So these are open to all international students who have successfully completed an eligible course of study at bachelor's degree level or above. Successful applicants can stay and work in the UK for 2 years or 3 years if they've completed a PhD qualification. From the 1st of January 2027, a graduate visa would be reduced to 18 months from 2 years for all students other than PhD students. So that's something to bear in mind. A graduate visa can't be extended. It's a one-time only visa, and those who have previously held leave under a doctorate extension scheme will not qualify for a graduate visa. An important thing to note is that a graduate visa does not lead to settlement in the route itself, although permission to remain as a graduate can count toward any future application for indefinite leave to remain based on 10 years long residence in the UK. When applying for graduate visa, there are various validity, suitability and eligibility requirements that must be met, and I'll go through these with you now in turn. So first of all, the validity requirements. These cover the practicalities of making a graduate visa application. So first of all, the correct form, an online form must be submitted, and the correct application fees must be paid. The fees are detailed on the slides, as you'll see. There's an £880 application fee, and then a £1,035 immigration health surcharge fee per year of the visa, so that double for 2 years. Your biometric information, so a photograph of your face and your fingerprints must be enrolled. This can sometimes be done using the information you've previously provided via the IDV app or by attending a biometrics appointment at a visa application centre. And evidence must be provided to prove your identity and nationality, so typically a valid passport. When making the application, you must be in the UK and you must hold or have last been granted permission as a student, so a holder of a student visa. And then if you've been awarded a scholarship or sponsorship for your fees while studying at university, some specific evidence will have to be provided in regards to that. Once you've submitted your application, a decision is typically received within 3 to 8 weeks from your biometrics information being enrolled. There isn't a priority service to speed up a decision with this route. Looking at the suitability requirements, these focus on the good character and conduct of the applicant. So you mustn't be in the UK in breach of immigration laws. So that's very important to make sure that you do get the application submitted prior to the expiry of your student visa. And then you mustn't fall for refusal under the general grounds of the immigration rules. And these focus on things like criminality, relying on false documents, or failing to disclose material information. So typically, if there haven't been any change of circumstances in this regard since your application for a student visa, these should be fine. It's also important to note that the general grounds of refusal include a provision that any debt outstanding to the NHS of at least £500 must be paid as well. Focusing on the eligibility requirements, so this route is a points-based route. So in total, you'll be awarded 70 points, and these include for successful completion of the course of study. The qualification requirement must be met, and you must have studied in the UK for at least 12 months. So I'll explain a bit more about each of these in turn. So for successful completion of the course, the sponsor must be a higher education provider with a track record of compliance. Now, this isn't something for you to worry about because Lancaster University meets this requirement. You must have successfully completed and studied the course during the last grant of permission to study. And if permitted to change a course of study without a fresh application, you must have completed the course to which you changed to. And the university must notify UKVI that you have successfully completed the course. And this is typically an administrative step which should proceed without a glitch. For the qualification requirement, you must have successfully completed a course of study, typically having been awarded a bachelor's degree or a postgraduate degree. As detailed on the slide, there are other relevant qualifications that will be eligible, but typically it'll be a bachelor's degree or postgraduate degree. An important thing to bear in mind is that if you must have secured the qualification during your last grant of student permission, and unless the last grant of permission was to undertake a student union sabbatical officer role. So you must have completed the course and the student permission you previously held prior to this role, if this applies to you. For the study requirement, so essentially you must have studied in the UK for 12 months. So if your course is 12 months or less, as long as you've studied in the UK for the full duration of that course, you're fine. If your course is longer than 12 months, at least 12 months of that time must have been spent in the UK. So the conditions of a grant of a student visa. So if you're successful, you'll be granted leave to remain for 2 years. As I stated earlier, this will reduce to 18 months from the 1st of January 2027. Or if you've completed a PhD, it'll be for 3 years. As the holder of a graduate visa, you can undertake employment, self-employment, or voluntary work. There's no rules about the types of employment or the salary you have to earn, which are applicable to the skilled worker route that Keelan will explain in more detail shortly. You're not allowed to work as a professional sports person, though. You're not able to access public funds, and you are able to continue to study as a graduate, but not a course that would otherwise be suitable for sponsorship as a student. So you are entitled to have your family members as dependents of a graduate visa if they already have permission to be in the UK as dependents of your student visa. So that applies to both partners and dependent children. For a partner, they must be able to meet the following relationship requirements. So the relationship must be genuine and subsisting. You must intend to live together throughout the duration of the graduate visa in the UK. And the applicant must not intend to stay in the UK beyond any permission granted to their partner. So essentially, you need to be planning to stay in the UK together for the same amount of time. For any dependent children, they must be under 18 at the date of application. They must not be living an independent life, so essentially still living with you as a part of a family unit, and there must be suitable arrangements for their care and accommodation in the UK. So there are various benefits to using the graduate route. So as I briefly mentioned, you'll have the permission to work at any skill level, which will allow you to build your employment experience in the UK and provides more freedom with deciding who you'd like to work for. And the graduate route is preferred by many employers prior to offering sponsorship. Because once you've obtained employment as a graduate, you can switch into another immigration category, which can lead to settlement, for example, a skilled worker visa, once you've gained experience. There are various documents you should be providing with a graduate visa application, specifically your valid passport, your e-visa, which you can download from online, your CAS, confirming your permission to study your course, evidence of completing the qualification, for example, your degree certificate or university transcript. If you have held any scholarship or sponsorship for the fees, a letter confirming that the person who financially supported you consents to you making the graduate application. And if you are applying with any dependents, partners or children, you'd need to provide documents regarding their identity and your relationship to them. So some frequently asked questions regarding the graduate route. Can students submit graduate applications before final results are received from the university? So a student sponsor must notify UKVI by the date of the application. If they haven't yet received notification and a CAS confirms that the student has been studying the qualification, UKVI will then need to reach out to the university. So ultimately that will just cause a delay for a decision being received. So it's better to wait for you've formally completed the course and UKVI have been notified prior to submitting the application. Can students submit a graduate visa application before all these course fees have been paid? So course completion does include the final payment of all course fees have been made. So without the settlement of fees, a student sponsor can't notify UKVI that the course has been successfully completed. So essentially you will need to make sure that all fees have been paid. If the name of your course has changed throughout the time you've been studying, if the course content remains the same, that's acceptable. Can you travel outside the UK after you've completed the course, but before you submit a graduate visa application? So you should be able to travel outside the UK during that period, but you will need to be in the UK when you submit the graduate visa application. So it's important to bear in mind that if your course completion date is much earlier than the date of your CAS expiry date, there is a risk that the Home Office may curtail your leave. And then I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Keelan Claffey, and she's going to explain to you in more detail about the skilled worker route.
Thank you, Alex. Hi, everyone. My name's Keelan, and I'm a solicitor at Latitude Law, and I'm going to be discussing the skilled worker route with you. And then at the very end, we're going to do a Q&A session where Alex and I can answer any outstanding questions that you have. So the skilled worker route is a very popular immigration route in the UK. The reason it's popular is because it leads to settlement in the UK after a period of 5 years. As at today's date, that's something I'll be addressing later. And it allows you to obviously live, study in the UK, work in the UK, and you can have dependents join you in the UK on the skilled worker route as well. Now, this is a sponsored route, so unless you are sponsored by a licensed sponsor in the UK, you cannot apply for permission to stay on the skilled worker route. We're often contacted by people who ask us if we can help them find sponsorship. That's not something we're involved in. We're not involved in the recruitment process. There is, however, a detailed register of licensed sponsors on the gov.uk website where you can have a look at the name of every single business in the UK as at that date that possesses a current and valid sponsor license and might be in a position to sponsor you for leave to remain in the UK. So as I've said here, after 5 years of residing in the UK as a skilled worker, you can apply for indefinite leave to remain. That would also apply to your dependents if they've completed 5 years as your dependent in the UK. And like the graduate route, there's validity, suitability, and eligibility requirements, which I'll go through with you now. So the validity requirements, there's a few here that are very specific to students. So this is what we're sort of focusing on with our validity requirements. So an applicant who is applying for permission to stay in the UK and has or last had permission as a student must fulfill condition A, B, or C, which you can see in front of you on the slides. So condition A is simply that you've completed the course of study for which your confirmation of acceptance for studies, known as a CAS, was assigned. So if you've completed your course, that's fine. Note that this doesn't say successfully completed your course. This is where the skilled worker route differs from the graduate route, in that there is actually no obligation within the skilled worker rules for you to have successfully completed your program in the UK in order to switch into the skilled worker route, just that you have completed all final modules. Condition B is that you are studying a full-time course of study at degree level or above with a higher education provider which has a track record of compliance, like Lancaster University. And your certificate of sponsorship, which is a digital document that is given to you by your sponsor, cannot have a start date, so that's the start date of your employment, that is any earlier than your course completion date. So what you will likely need to do if you're in this scenario is provide a copy of your CAS, your most recent CAS, to your prospective sponsor. And this way they know and they have it in writing, the estimated completion date of your course, so that they can select the appropriate start date for the course. And then condition C is for people who are studying a full-time course of study leading to the award of a PhD with a higher education provider which has a track record of compliance, and the certificate of sponsorship has a start date of no earlier than 24 months after the start date of the course. So there's that exception there for PhD students. So these are the validity requirements. So as long as you can satisfy one of these three conditions, then you could switch directly from a student visa onto a skilled worker visa without switching onto the graduate route first. So eligibility requirements, again, this is another points-based route. You have to score 70 points in order to get permission to switch onto the skilled worker route or to make an application for entry clearance if you're applying from overseas. So you get 20 points for sponsorship, 20 points for job at an appropriate skill level, and then 10 points for English language skills. Very important to note here is that the English language requirement is increasing from its current level of B1 to B2 from the 8th of January 2026. So if you don't have a degree that was taught or researched in English, then you might potentially have to sit a test at level B2, and you will be assessed in all four components, which means reading, writing, speaking, and listening. So there's different types of tests that you can take for various UK visas, but for the skilled worker route, you are going to be assessed in all four components. And then you must also score 20 tradable points, which I'm going to get onto shortly. So first, 20 points for sponsorship. So you simply need a certificate of sponsorship from an employer that holds a sponsor license, and this must be a genuine offer of employment. What that means is that this cannot be a job role that has been created solely to facilitate your entry to or permission to remain in the UK. You must also have a job at an appropriate skill level, so 20 points. Typically, the job must be eligible under Appendix Skilled Occupations of the immigration rules. That's a really important appendix. So if you're wondering whether your proposed job or something that you might want to do in the UK falls within the scope of the skilled worker route, do go onto gov.uk and look for Appendix Skilled Occupations, and that is an exhaustive list of all of the occupations that are eligible for sponsorship on the skilled worker route. And then you've also got the temporary shortage list and the immigration salary list, which can include some roles that are sort of in lower skilled occupations. Some roles require an ATAS certificate that includes various scientific engineering roles. However, that would only apply if you were going to be working for a sponsor that had both a skilled worker and a student sponsor license. So for example, if you're going to be working for a university, then you might need an ATAS certificate. But if your sponsor does not also have a sponsor license for the student route, then that wouldn't apply to you. Important to note that if you have dependents who are looking to enter or remain with you in the UK, you must be working in a job that's at RQF level 6 or higher, not RQF levels 3 to 5. And then the English language requirements, so if you have a degree from a UK-based university, so bachelor's, master's, or doctorate, that itself is going to suffice. All you need is your final certificate, your final transcript, or a letter from the university confirming the information that usually appears on a certificate, and that you've completed a course, the date you completed it, what you were awarded at the end of that. Otherwise, you would need an IELTS certificate in at least level CEFR B1 as at today's date, but as I've mentioned previously, that's going to increase to level B2 from the 8th of January next year. Okay, so coming on to tradable points for salary. Okay, so this is where it sort of gets a little bit complicated because there's quite a few options that can apply to you. So option A is just the standard option. So the going rate for skilled worker visas as at today's date is £41,700 sterling, but that is just the general thresholds. There's two different figures that your sponsor is going to be considering before they issue a certificate of sponsorship to you. And that is the general threshold that applies to you, but then also whatever the going rate is for your occupation code, and they have to pay you whichever is the higher of those two figures. So if the going rate for your occupation code is higher than £41,700 sterling, then that's the figure that they would pay you. And that would also need to be prorated depending on the number of weekly working hours that you are being sponsored to do. So again, coming back to that appendix, skilled occupations of the immigration rules that I mentioned previously, all of the going rates for occupations are set out within that appendix. So if you're not sure what the going rate would be for your particular job, that's where you would find it. Okay, so coming on to option B, that's for those holding a PhD relevant to their job, which means the going rate, this is the general threshold, is £37,500 or 90% of the going rate for your occupation code, again, whichever is higher. Helpfully, Appendix Skilled Occupations calculates these figures for you, so you don't need to do the math when you go on to Appendix Skilled Occupations. There's a column at the top that has headings, and it sets out what option you're looking at and what the figure would be beneath that. Option C is for those holding a PhD in a STEM subject. General threshold is lowered to £33,400 or 80% of the going rate for the occupation code, whichever of those two is higher. Option D is for jobs on the immigration salary list, formerly known as the shortage occupation list. That general threshold is also £33,400 sterling, but there is no separate discount to the going rate under option D. Option E is for new entrants. This is the one that applies to students and graduates. So general threshold, £33,400 sterling or 70% of the going rate for the occupation code, whichever of those two figures is higher. So who qualifies for that new entrant salary discount under option E? If you were under the age of 26 on the date that you look to switch or make an entry clearance application for the skilled worker route, then you will automatically meet the new entrant criteria. Otherwise, if your most recent permission, other than as a visitor, was under the student visa route, the permission must either be current or have expired less than 2 years before the date of application. New entrant continued here. So if the job for which you are being sponsored is a postdoctoral position in any of the below SOC 2020 occupation codes, again, you can also meet the new entrant criteria. These slides are going to be available, made available by Lancaster University, by the way, so if you want to refer to these later, they will be there for you. Option E, so the job for which the applicant is being sponsored is in a UK regulated profession, and you must be working towards a recognised UK professional qualification for that profession, or you're working towards full registration or chartered status with the relevant professional body for the job in which you are being sponsored. If either of those two apply to you, then potentially you could also be sponsored as a new entrant. And then finally, if your most recent permission was as a graduate, and if that permission has expired, it expired less than 2 years before the date of application, then you can also be sponsored as a new entrant. So we see this quite often at Latitude Law because we have lots of corporate clients that are employing people who are on the graduate route, and they're really keen to keep these graduates post expiry of the visa. And so they contact us and say, what option applies to them? You know, what sort of figures do we need to be paying them in order to sponsor them as new entrants? And so we deal with a lot of queries and of applications for people switching from the graduate route directly into the skilled worker route. Now, what's important to note is that granting the application must not mean that your combined permission as a skilled worker, a graduate, and a Tier 2 migrant, which is the former name for the skilled worker route, would be more than 4 years in total. So to give you an example, if you're on the graduate route and you spend a period of 2 years on the graduate route and you were then sponsored as a skilled worker, you could only be sponsored as a new entrant on the skilled worker route for a period of 2 years. So your initial period of sponsorship would just be 2 years. And then if you wanted to stay on the skilled worker route, you'd need to be sponsored for a further 3 years before you could apply for indefinite leave to remain, but you would not be able to benefit from option E because you have exhausted your permission to be in the UK as a new entrant. Okay, so the benefits of recruiting new entrants for employers. The obvious one is paying you a lower salary. So the general threshold, as I said, is 33,400 or just 70% of the going rate for your occupation codes. That makes new entrants really attractive to employers, particularly smaller businesses that maybe can't meet the relatively high thresholds that you'll see within appendix skilled occupations of the immigration rules, especially for businesses that are outside of London, where salaries tend to be lower. There's no separate category within appendix skilled occupations for people who are being sponsored to work in London and people who are being sponsored to work outside of London. So a lot of businesses outside of the capital might struggle to meet some of those figures. So this is a way to get people into the business, but can pay them a little bit less. They can assess your employment over the 2-year period prior to offering sponsorships. That really applies again to people who are on the graduate route. So an employer gets to know you over that period of 2 years or 18 months or 3 years if you're a PhD student. And then if they decide that they want to sponsor you at the end of that period, they can do so. Also, with the skilled worker route, so say you're somebody who switched directly from the student route onto the skilled worker route, even if you are just sponsored for a couple of years initially as a new entrant, it's a lower salary, so your employer isn't committing to as much as if they were to recruit somebody who doesn't qualify for that new entrant salary discount. And yeah, it's becoming a common employment strategy for employers. There's also a lot of graduate schemes out there that employers offer. And so this allows employers to recruit people to either directly from the student route or directly from the graduate route. Another point I wanted to mention here actually on this slide is if an employer sponsors you directly from the student route onto the skilled worker route, so you don't go onto the graduate route, you go straight onto skilled worker, your employer does not have to pay what's called the immigration skills charge. And that is huge for a lot of employers because the immigration skills charge can be really expensive. It's currently £364 per year for small businesses and £1,000 per year for larger businesses, which is a lot of money. So if a business was sponsoring you for 4 years and their class is a large business, that's £4,000 that they're paying toward the immigration skills charge. But if you're being sponsored from the student route directly onto this route, they don't have to pay that fee. So that makes students also very attractive for sponsorship. There's also a separate salary requirement for health and care workers. This is known as option K. So health and care workers are paid a lower general threshold of £25,000 or the going rate for their particular occupation code, whichever is higher. These going rates are a little bit different. You'll find them further down in appendix skilled occupations from table 3 onwards. And these are based on national pay scales in line with the latest data from the Office for National Statistics and the latest pay scale data as set out by the NHS. And the NHS use a banding system to work out what your pay would be. So it's up to the NHS trust usually that you're going to be working for or the business that you're working for, what your salary would be. So it's a little bit more complicated. Okay, so the financial requirement for the skilled worker route. So if you've been in the UK for less than 12 months, then you need to pay 1,000, or sorry, you need to evidence that you have at least £1,270 in personal funds available to you for at least 28 consecutive days prior to the date that you make an application to switch or make an application for entry clearance. Otherwise, if you've been in the UK for 12 months or more, you automatically satisfy that financial requirement and you don't need to worry about having personal funds. It's also possible for your sponsor to certify your maintenance on your certificate of sponsorship. We see this a lot with people who are applying for entry clearance, so people who are overseas that are coming into the UK as skilled workers. Their sponsors will certify their maintenance, which means that they are making, giving an undertaking that confirms that they will cover basically the cost of living for the first month until you actually receive some form of remuneration for them for the work that you're carrying out. So it is possible for your sponsor to certify your costs, but if they don't want to, give that undertaking, then you would need to evidence that you have the £1,270 available to you. And you may also need additional funds if you have dependents applying with you. And that depends, of course, on how many dependents are applying to switch or come into the UK with you under this route. The criminal record certificate only applies to some occupation codes, and it also only applies to entry clearance applications. So if you are in the UK and you were switching into the skilled worker route, then the criminal record certificate wouldn't apply to you. However, certain employers might have their own internal policies as to what documents you need to provide. So that would be determined by your employer. But from an immigration law perspective, it wouldn't be a requirement if you're applying to switch. So conditions of status as a skilled worker, usually 3 or 5 years, but it depends on the length of the role specified in your cost. So it is entirely up to your sponsor to decide how long they want to sponsor you for. Most often in practice, we see people being sponsored for either 2 or 3 years initially, and then if the employer wants to keep them on after that period, they will sponsor them for a further 2 or 3 years, however long it takes to get you to the full 5 years that you need in order to apply for indefinite leave to remain in the UK. There's no access to public funds. That's a very common condition on most immigration routes. There's very few routes where you would ever get access to public funds. Work is permitted in the role that you are being sponsored for. However, you can do supplementary employment for up to 20 hours per week, so long as that falls outside of the hours specified on your certificate of sponsorship. So a second job cannot interfere with the job that you are being sponsored for. Voluntary work is permitted. You can also study, but again, that cannot interfere with the job that you're being sponsored for. And at the minute, we are still on a 5-year route to settlement. However, some of you may have seen in the media, the government are proposing to increase this 5-year route to a 10-year route, but that remains to be seen. We're also not sure whether any transitional provisions will apply. So that means that people who are already on the skilled worker route or will shortly be applying to switch into the skilled worker route before any of these proposed changes come into force, are they going to still be able to benefit from the 5-year route, or will they also be switched onto a 10-year route? Again, what we see in practice mostly is that there are transitional provisions that are put in place for people who are already on that route or have pending applications to switch into that route. Because when you made that application or when you switched into that route, you had expectations based on what was set out within the rules, and typically they take that into consideration, the fairness involved in transitioning people to a different set of rules that they didn't initially sign up for when they applied to switch into that route. But that remains to be seen. We have very little information, to be honest, regarding when or if this 10-year route to settlement is going to be implemented. There's obviously been a lot of controversy around it, so it could be the case that they just scrap it and leave it as a 5-year route, or it might be that people who earn a certain amount or work in certain occupations might remain on a 5-year route to settlement, and then others might have to switch onto a 10-year route to settlement. But as and when changes become available or updates become available, we will publish them on our website. So please do have a look on our website for any updates. Okay, so documents that you need to make a skilled worker application, very similar again to the graduate route. So you need to have a current and valid passport. You should also be able to provide details of your e-visa. So for those of you who haven't already set up your UK visas and immigration accounts and got access to your e-visa, please make sure you do that as soon as possible. If you are required to satisfy that financial requirement, that you would need to provide a bank statement, of course. The English language requirement documents, so that could be a degree, it could be your IELTS test results. It could also be the case if you have a degree that was taught or researched in English in another country, you might potentially be able to rely on that, but you would typically need a certificate from ECTIS, who are another body who would verify that degree as being equivalent to a UK bachelor's degree or higher. You might need a criminal record certificate, again, only if you're applying for entry clearance. If you have a scholarship or sponsorship, you might need a letter from your sponsorship or scholarship provider confirming that they consent to you switching into the skilled worker routes. That might be a requirement that applies to you. And then, of course, if you have family members who are applying with you, you will need to provide evidence of your relationship to those family members. Things like marriage certificates, birth certificates, proof of cohabitation. That's really important if you are unmarried partners or you've entered into a marriage that isn't legally recognized in the UK, you would need to provide proof of cohabitation, typically covering a period of 2 years prior to the date that your dependent partner looks to switch into your route. So cohabitation can include things like tenancy agreements and joint names, council tax bills, utility bills, even bank statements. And these documents don't all have to be in joint names. They can be in separate names, so long as they confirm that you reside at the same address. So proof of cohabitation is really key if you have dependents. So make sure you get your dependents on as many bills as possible, just to make it as easy as possible for family members to switch. Okay, work conditions for students. Yeah, so for students studying a full-time course at degree level or above, the following is permitted. So you can work part-time during term time. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these conditions already. So that's up to 20 hours per week. And you can work full-time during vacations, which includes the period before your course starts in the UK. So many students will get their student visa issued a full month prior to the course start date on their CAS, and you can work full-time in that month if you wanted to. If you have to do a work placement that is part of your course, that's permitted by the rules. You can also work full-time as a postgraduate doctor or dentist on a recognized foundation program when permission has been granted for that type of course. You can work as a student union sabbatical officer for up to 2 years, and students can transition to the Innovator Founder visa. So students who have completed their course can establish their business whilst they have a pending application to switch into the Innovator Founder route, but that will only apply from the 25th of November of this year. Students cannot be self-employed or engage in business activity unless you have already made an application for permission to switch into the Innovator Founder route. And then you can also work as an entertainer or professional sports person. And you can fill a full-time permanent vacancy. Sorry, you cannot fill a full-time permanent vacancy unless it's on a recognized foundation program or you're working as a student union sabbatical officer. So that's what you can and cannot do. So when can you take on a full-time job? So you can take on a full-time job once you've completed your course, i.e. outside of term time. You should not take on a full-time permanent position until you have submitted a valid skilled worker or graduate application, and your contract should be fixed term or temporary whilst you are in the UK as a student. For a graduate visa, of course, you must have successfully completed your course to submit the graduate visa application, but for the skilled worker visa, you simply must have completed the course. There's no successfully completed the course condition there. Okay, so common questions that we get. How do you find the list of sponsor license holders that I mentioned earlier in the presentation? Again, this is all available on gov.uk and we've included the link there within our slides. How do you know if the job is eligible for the skilled worker visa? Again, you're going to go onto gov.uk and look for that appendix skilled occupations of the immigration rules that I mentioned earlier. What information or documents are required to establish genuine vacancy? These could be things like job advertisements, perhaps if you've applied for a job via LinkedIn or a website like Indeed, or if you've gone through a recruiter. It's good to include evidence of how you actually applied for that job or how you were identified as a prospective candidate for this job role. If you had an interview with your prospective sponsor, they might have interview notes, so that could be included. Your curriculum vitae, I'm sure many of you have those already, so you can include a copy of your CV, which just sets out your career history and academic background, and then also a job description, so something that's includes details of exactly what it is that you're going to do and perhaps how that relates to the degree that you've just finished or skills that you already have. And can you switch employers when you are on the skilled worker route? Yes, you can. So you are not tied to one sponsor. If you want to qualify for leave to remain after 5 years, you can make what's called a change of employment application if you are switching to a different job from within the UK. But of course, that would require you to get another certificate of sponsorship from your other sponsor. So your skilled worker visa is not transferable to a different employer. So if you're sponsored by one business, you can't say, well, do you know what? It's not working out here. I don't like this job. I'm going to leave this business and I'm going to go work for another business, but the other business doesn't have a sponsor license. That's not going to work. That would be a breach of the conditions of your skilled worker visa. So you would have to be sponsored by the business that you want to switch to, and you'd have to make a fresh application for permission to stay as a skilled worker by making that change of employment application. And you can only start working for that new employer once the application has been approved. So you do require permission before you do that. Okay, other options for graduates. These are routes that we get asked about quite a lot. So of course there's the family route. So many students will come to the UK, they might enter into a relationship with somebody who's British or legally settled in the UK, and they could potentially switch into the family route for permission to remain in the UK. The family route, of course, is another route to settlement, and that is 5 years as well. So once you've completed 5 years, usually on the family route, you can apply to settle. There is also a 10-year family route, but that's usually for people who don't meet all of the criteria to be granted leave to remain as a partner or spouse. So potentially you could be placed on a 10-year route, but I won't get into that for the purposes of this presentation. There's also the Innovator Founder route. So that is for people who want to establish a business that is really unlike anything else on the UK market, and they want to run that business in the UK. So the Innovator Founder route is an option for entrepreneurs who want to stay in the UK and want to start a new business. However, for that route, you do need endorsements. That's a two-stage application process. The first thing you do is you apply for endorsement from an endorsing body. And then once you've secured endorsement, you can then make an application for permission to switch into the Innovator Founder route. The global talent route is very similar in that sense, in that it's a two-stage application process. So again, with the global talent route, unless you've won a prestigious award, you need to apply for endorsement first from a designated competent body. And then after you've secured endorsement from them, you can then make an application to switch onto the global talent route, or you can make applications 1 and 2 at the same time, so stage 1 and stage 2, which many students have to do because their permission is due to come to an end. So in order to avoid becoming an overstayer in the UK, they have to apply for both endorsement and permission to remain in the UK at the same time. And then, as I said before, most of the above are 5-year routes to settlement. The Innovator Founder route is just a 3-year route to settlement, and Global Talent can also be a 3-year route to settlement, but only if you are endorsed under the exceptional talent criteria and not the exceptional promise criteria. So there's a couple of endorsing bodies that will endorse people who are at an early stage in their career. They might be considered under the exceptional promise criteria. And people who are assessed as the exceptional promise criteria do need to complete 5 years residence in the UK as global talent migrants before they can apply for indefinite leave to remain. And then just some more useful links. So of course the graduate visa route, our own website, we have some details there on the graduate visa route, skilled worker again, and then our update on the government white paper that was announced earlier this year. So you can see our comments on that. And like I said earlier, we will always publish updates on our website as and when we become aware of them. Okay, and now we're just moving on to the Q&As. I think there's a few messages in the chat here, so I'm just going to pull that up. We'll start with those, and if people want to come off mute, we'll go ahead. I think the first one's about the new entrant for the skilled worker visa from ISA. So I'll just read that out. So employed as a graduate visa on a graduate visa for 2 years, you took a year-long career break and then started your master's in October 2025 on a student visa. When you graduate in September 26, will you still be eligible to apply for a skilled worker visa on the new entrant route? Yes, you can, but they will take into account the fact that you've already completed 2 years as a graduate. So it doesn't have to be consecutive years. It just has to be in total. So you could only be sponsored then as a new entrant for a period of 2 years, assuming you're not doing a PhD. You've not done a PhD, sorry. Are there any other questions? Did anyone else want to ask anything of Alex or I?
I can see another question in the chat about the graduate visa. So my CAS end date is the 30th of September. I studied a 1-year MSc degree. I left the UK in the 15th of September. I intend to be outside the UK from the 15th of September to the 15th of January. I would like to ask if that's too long to affect their ability to come back to apply for a graduate visa, because their current visa ends on the 30th of January 2026.
Right. So as long as you still have valid leave to be in the UK as a student, I don't see any issues with you traveling abroad and then coming back to the UK whilst your student leave is still valid. You just have to be aware of the fact that if you finished your course earlier than initially expected, then what your student sponsor will do is they'll notify UK Visas and Immigration that you've completed your course early. And what UKVI will do is they will shorten your student visa because they don't think that you require the permission that they initially granted to you. And often if you get that notice of curtailment, as it's called, when you're outside the UK, that's it. You cannot return to the UK as a student anymore because your permission is cancelled with immediate effect if you are physically present outside the UK. So if that's a concern, that's something you need to have a think about. But otherwise, there's nothing within the immigration rules that stops you from going abroad during those 4 months after your course ends and your student visa is still valid, and then coming back to apply for permission to switch into the graduate route, so long as you don't get a notice of curtailment in the meantime. I think
I
we've got
can't see
another
any.
question
Oh,
here in
sorry.
the Q&A. Um, if your partner and I are both on student visas, would we both have to find separate sponsorship for the skilled worker visa, or could one of us be a dependent? Good question. One of you can be a dependent, so long as you can meet the criteria for unmarried partners. Again, like I've said previously, they typically expect to see proof of cohabitation for a period of at least 2 years prior to the date that the partner applies to switch onto their partner's skilled worker visa as a dependent. There's also another thing I'll say on that point. There's some validity requirements for dependents on the skilled worker route, so I would just have a look at those. So if you go to Appendix Skilled Worker of the immigration rules and then have a look at the requirements for dependents, you can have a look at the validity requirements on there as well. Don't see anything else unless there's something else that's come up in the
No.
chat. Don't think so. Right. Well, if there's no further questions, can let everyone go. Please do contact us if you do have any follow-up questions. There is a dedicated email address for University of Lancaster inquiries. What I can do actually is I can put that in the chat if I can find it. And then if you do have any inquiries, you can just let us know. I think the email address is just Lancaster inquiries at latitudelaw.com. So I'll put that in the chat there in case anyone has anything that they think of after the call. I also appreciate that not everybody wants to put their questions within a presentation for others to see. So if you want to ask us something anonymously. Gerald, when will be the best time to start applying? Applying for what? The graduate visa once you've completed your course. Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, I'm just trying to get this email address in here and I'm struggling to copy and paste it. But yeah, like I said, if you'd rather ask questions sort of offline to us later on and you'd feel more comfortable doing that, that's absolutely fine by us. We're very happy to either email you. We can also have calls with people that have queries. Just putting that in the chat now. There we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if anyone wants to email us on there, please do so. And of course, that's just going to come through to our team and then we can deal with it accordingly. Just give people a couple more minutes maybe in case there's further questions. People might be typing. You can also come off, I don't know if you can come off mute actually in the presentation. If not, then I apologize. Richard, if you wanted to ask a question, you can just email us on Lancaster inquiries at latitudelaw.com if you wanted to ask something after the presentation. Okay, well, I don't think we've got any further questions. Jennifer, is there anything else that you wanted us to address or anything you wanted to add?
No, I think that was perfect. Just a big thank you to Latitude Law for delivering this webinar today. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to do this. Yeah, I'm saying that on behalf of myself and the students on this webinar today. Latitude Law are a great service, so please make use of that email if you do have any questions. Or we do have our International Careers Manager, May Wang, who can also answer maybe some more general questions about navigating the graduate market as an international student. I think there might be one more question in the chat that I'll let you answer.
All right, thank you. So Kathy, your CAS ends on the 30th of September, last assignment on the 5th. You completed everything and left the UK on the 15th. Does that mean completing the course early? There is, I suppose, possibility that your student sponsor might report to UKVI that you've completed the program earlier than initially anticipated, but that's something I would check with the university directly to see what information they're going to give to UKVI to see if there's any possibility of your student visa being curtailed. Because if you've already successfully completed the program, they might have already reported that to UKVI. So I would check with the international team to see what they say on that point. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending today. Yeah, the slides are going to be shared separately by the university, I believe. Just seeing that question. Yeah. Okay, well, that's everything. Thank you so much again for your attendance, and you will know if your visa is curtailed through email. Yes, yes, you will, Kathy. So as long as all of your contact details are up to date within your UK Visas and Immigration account, then UKVI should send the notice of curtailment to you directly via email. Okay. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Have a lovely day. Thanks very much. Take care.